Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 59 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Between the 1830s and 1860s, a clandestine communications and transportation network called the Underground Railroad helped thousands of slaves escape to freedom. Today, we are going to investigate and explore this secret network with Eric Foner, a Pulitzer Prize winning historian and author of Gateway to Freedom, The Hidden History of the Underground Railroad. During our investigation, Eric reveals what the Underground Railroad was and how it functioned, how slaves escaped slavery and what their escape experience was like, and what life was like for both the men and women who worked on the Underground Railroad and the slaves who reached and settled in free states. Are you ready to explore the harrowing and clandestine world of the Underground Railroad? Let's go meet our guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is the DeWitt Clinton Professor of History at Columbia University. He specializes in the history of American slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. He is an award-winning historian who won the Pulitzer, Bancroft, and Lincoln Prizes for his book, The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery. And today, we are going to put his expertise in American slavery to good use as we discuss his new book, Gateway to Freedom, The Hidden History of the Underground Railroad. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Eric Foner.
Yes, thanks. They're very nice to be here.
The Underground Railroad represents an important transportation network prior to and during the Civil War. But I would be willing to wager that if most of us were asked to describe what the network was, we would probably say something to the effect of Harriet Tubman, slaves, and freedom. Eric, would you help us flesh out our answer? Would you provide us with a brief overview of the Underground Railroad?
Certainly. Well, I'm sure you're right that many people have heard of Harriet Tubman, of course. She's a very well-known figure in American history now. I would say the phrase, the Underground Railroad, is pretty well known. But people sometimes have a kind of an exaggerated, image of it. They take the railroad metaphor a little too literally with, regular stations and stops and routes and agents, almost as if it isn't really a railroad with a schedule and that kind of thing. I would say the Underground Railroad should be understood as a series of local networks that communicated with each other and assisted fugitive slaves in reaching freedom from the South. It didn't have highly regularized routes, and these local networks kind of rose and fell over time. One shouldn't think of it as a permanent, highly organized structure. But nonetheless, it was these local groups in many, many communities, including rural areas and then big cities like New York, Philadelphia, places like that, which did manage to assist a considerable number of fugitives who were escaping from slavery. Now, what I'm referring to so far is in the North. Once you get below the Mason-Dixon line in the slave states, things are much less organized, and most slaves basically escape on their own initiative and may have gotten assistance from kind of almost random people, that is, free black slaves, sometimes some white Quakers, almost who they happen to encounter almost accidentally. There were people like Harriet Tubman. She's fairly unique. She went back into the South 7 or 8 times after escaping herself from Maryland and led out maybe 70 or 80 people altogether. That was remarkable and amazingly courageous, but not particularly typical. Most people who escaped stayed out. They didn't come back to assist other people.
Do we have any idea how many slaves the Underground Railroad network helped escape to freedom?
This is very hard to say for obvious reasons. Much of the work was conducted in secrecy, and then there were people who escaped who didn't get assistance from anybody. My estimate, and it really is a guess, so to speak, or as they say in public opinion polls, it has a large margin of error. My guess is that between 1830 and 1860, about 1,000 slaves a year managed to reach freedom, assisted by somebody or other, local groups of one kind or another. So that's 30,000 people reaching freedom in Canada or parts of the North in the 30 years before the Civil War. And that's a remarkable thing, 30,000 individuals getting their freedom. However, there were 4 million slaves in the United States in 1860. So the Underground Railroad was not kind of destroying the institution of slavery or undermining it really in highly significant ways. But nonetheless, the actions of these fugitives and of the people who assisted them in the Underground Railroad were very important in terms of the politics of slavery and widening the gap between North and South, and eventually in helping to bring on the Civil War.
When exactly did Underground Railroad societies or networks start to form?
Well, of course, people have been escaping from slavery ever since there was slavery, so going way back, and there were individuals who assisted them now and then. I say the Underground Railroad really began as an organized series of networks in 1835 when a black abolitionist, David Ruggles, in New York City formed what was called the New York Vigilance Committee. This was an organization mostly of African Americans in New York, but also with some white abolitionists active also. And it was originally formed to stop the kidnapping or to combat the kidnapping of black people off the streets of New York City. New York had abolished slavery by this time, but it was very closely tied to the South through the cotton trade. And there were gangs who just preyed on free blacks, especially children, and would just sort of grab someone off the street, take them to a boat, and send them back into send them into slavery, even though that was totally illegal, of course. People know about this a little bit because of the movie 12 Years a Slave, which was about a kidnapped person which was prominent a few years ago. Anyway, this organization quickly also moved to start assisting fugitive slaves, and it called for other cities to set up these vigilance committees also. And by about 1840, you had committees like this in Philadelphia, in Boston, Albany, maybe in the early 1840s. And so by the early 1840s, you do get this set of networks that are communicating with each other and assisting fugitives. In other words, if you reach one of these groups, often in Philadelphia, then they will send you on to New York. Then New York will send you on to Boston or New Bedford or Syracuse or Albany. Later, after 1850, they have to send them to Canada because the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law makes it much more dangerous to remain in the North anywhere as a fugitive slave. So really, it's in the 1840s that the Underground Railroad as a system comes into its own.
You're describing the Underground Railroad network, and I'm struck by how similar it seems to how the committees of correspondence were set up during the American Revolution. As we know the context for the committees of correspondence, could you provide us with some context of what American society is like in the mid-1830s and 1840s that required this new communications and transportation network to be set up?
Yeah, it's not a bad analogy. Of course, the communication system in the time of the Revolution for the committees and correspondence was much more primitive. It took quite a while for mail to get from one place to another. By the 1830s, you have railroads already being built. By the 1840s, you have the telegraph. So instantaneous communication is a lot simpler in the time of the Underground Railroad. But the problem is that the Underground Railroad is facing is, you might say, the power of slavery in the United States. By the 1830s and 40s, all the northern states have abolished slavery. Nonetheless, many of them, like New York, are quite tied into the slave system. The economy of slavery is connected to that of the North. Many of the profits of slavery flow into the North. And there are a lot of people in the North who are perfectly happy to assist in returning fugitive slaves. And so, on the one hand, you have a growing gap, so to speak, or division between free states and slave states, which eventually flows over into national politics. But on the other, you have all these tight connections between many parts of the North and the South. And so the Underground Railroad is kind of trying to navigate that. And now, of course, they are violating the law. Local law, federal law makes it illegal to assist a fugitive slave. And that's one of the things, it's important about the Underground Railroad. This is a case of what I guess we would call, civil disobedience, violating unjust laws. But on the other hand, there are plenty of people who think the law has to be obeyed, and even people who are not in favor of slavery. Take Abraham Lincoln, who hated slavery, no question about it, but was, a believer in the law, the rule of law, the Constitution. Lincoln once wrote in a famous letter about fugitives, "I hate to see them hunted down, but I bite my lip and keep silent." Why does he keep silent? He never assisted a fugitive slave before the Civil War. Why? Because he believes in the rule of law. Even distasteful laws must be obeyed, otherwise the whole system of law falls apart. So that's another kind of dilemma that is facing people who want to take part in Underground Railroad activities.
Eric, earlier you mentioned David Ruggles, and Gateway to Freedom focuses specifically on how the Underground Railroad operated in New York City. Is David Ruggles and the formation of the Underground Railroad network there why the study of the Underground Railroad in New York City warranted a special case study?
Well, it is true, of course, you're right, that my book sort of focuses on New York City for two reasons, really. Ruggles is an important part of it, but really one is that New York City is almost completely neglected in existing literature on the Underground Railroad. Most of that focuses on New England, on upstate New York, Ohio. Now, I'm dealing with the eastern section. I don't deal with Ohio and Western Underground Railroad because New York was so closely tied to the slave South that the Underground Railroad was actually quite small in New York, although pretty active indeed. And most literature on it says very little. If you take general books on the Underground Railroad and look in the index, you'll find hardly any entries for New York City. So that's one thing. The second thing, though, is that through serendipity, a student actually alerted me to a remarkable document that is in the Rare Book and Manuscripts Library of Columbia University here, where I teach, which was a record kept by Sidney Howard Gay, an abolitionist editor in New York. And in the 1850s, he kept these two little notebooks recording the stories of fugitive slaves who passed through New York City in those 2 years, 1855 and 1856, over 200 men, women, and children. This was a remarkable document. You've got the voices, the experiences of these fugitive slaves in the act of escaping. It also talked about how they got to New York and where Gay sent them when they to get to be free. And I had never seen this this document was barely known. It had been cited by one or two people, but it had never really been analyzed or used very effectively. And this kind of opened up the story of the Underground Railroad in New York City in a way that was impossible without that document. So in a sense, I worked outward from what Gay called the record of fugitives, which, by the way, we've now digitalized and put online. So anyone who is interested in seeing it and reading some of these remarkable stories of these fugitives, just Google record of fugitives and it'll bring you to our website with not only the document but a transcript, which I prepared because the handwriting is sometimes a little hard to read. So really, that's why I started with this document and worked outward. So in a sense, that's what made me begin in New York City. But since the Underground Railroad, by definition, connects different places, I then had to start working on Philadelphia, on Wilmington, Delaware, Baltimore, and then New England. So it kind of works outward from New York. But New York was the hub, in a sense, of this eastern network of the Underground Railroad.
You also mentioned that the Underground Railroad started with something called the New York Vigilance Society. Would you tell us about that society and the types of people who participated in it?
Well, as I mentioned before, David Ruggles, the New York Vigilance Committee, David Ruggles, the black abolitionist, founded this in 1835. It was interracial. The board of directors, or whatever you call it, managers, was both black and white activists in New York City. Most of the members, though, or it's not even members, it wasn't really an organization that had membership, but they had meetings, which a lot of people would come to periodically and raise money for them. But most of those were free blacks in New York City. New York was both very closely tied to the South, but also had a very vibrant, it had the largest free black community by the 1830s in the northern states. And so there was a kind of militant group of black people there who were anxious to work with this organization. And as I said before, they both assisted in trying to combat the kidnapping of black people off the streets, and second of all, giving aid to fugitive slaves from the South. And it was founded in 1835, and in one form or another, it went through various incarnations. It lasted all the way up to the Civil War.
I'm curious about how the Underground Railroad worked and about the slaves' escape experience. Is there an example you could provide of a slave who escaped that these societies helped escape?
Oh, there were quite a few, and that's what I say the record of fugitives of Sidney Howard Gay is so remarkable, because through it you can trace a whole series of people escaping. I mean, one of the things that struck me, one of the interesting stories, is groups of slaves who escaped by ship. We don't really think about that when we think of the Underground Railroad. But there were these sea captains. One was a guy named Albert Fountain, who ran a ship which just plied the trade up and down the coast between Virginia and Philadelphia and New York. And he would hide fugitives on his ship. And several, or quite a few, maybe 20 or 30 of the fugitive slaves in the record of fugitives of Sidney Howard Gay escaped hidden on the ship called the City of Richmond of Albert Fountain. You know, and they paid him. I mean, he was doing this partly out of belief and partly to make money. And they had to pay him money to be hidden on his ship. And then you can trace them out. Often they were landed at Wilmington, Delaware, where a Quaker abolitionist, Thomas Garrett, met them and then in a wagon got them. I mean, Wilmington is like 5 or 6 miles from the Pennsylvania border, and he quickly would just get them over the border where they would be met by some Quaker rural families there, and they would send him to Philadelphia, where the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee was headed by another black abolitionist, William Still. Still would send them by train, basically, by this time, to New York, where Sidney Howard Gay and his people would meet them, and then Gay would send them on. So very quickly, actually, you know, the train is pretty quick. You could get from Virginia up to Canada within several days, you know. So by the 1850s, we shouldn't think of fugitives, you know, in the kind of old image, just running in the woods, you know, hiding out during the day and running at night. A lot of them are using more modern modes of transportation. These ships, railroads, they're getting on trains with false papers and that kind of thing. So you get, you know, there's a great deal of ingenuity, there's a great deal of courage. And my book tries to tell these stories of these individual people, most of whom are lost to history. We don't really know much about what happened to them after they left New York City. A few of them pop up in documents later on, but, you know, they're mostly anonymous. And one of the problems for historians, some of them change their names when they get to the North because they don't want to, you know, be identified. So it's like a very complicated detective story, really, doing this research.
Where does a slave's journey to freedom begins? I'd have to think that it begins with a thought process of trying to plan an escape and the pros and cons of trying to escape. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question, you know, because Gay, in this record of fugitives, asked them questions. He was a journalist. He interviewed them. And one of the things he asked them is, why did you decide to escape? You know, now look, a lot of people try to escape and failed. It was not easy to get out. You know, the number who, got out was a small percentage of those who try to escape and failed, were recaptured, that kind of thing. But some of them just said, I was tired of being a slave. That's why I escaped. You know, so, and many of them said they had thought about it a number of times, but usually it was a specific incident that triggered this escape. It was often a beating or some violent abuse that they suffered. Very often it was either the threat of being sold or having a family member sold, a wife, a child sold, that led them to try to escape. So there was usually some immediate cause that triggered it. But as you say, the thought process was there. The most famous fugitive in American history, Frederick Douglass, who escaped through New York City in 1838 from Baltimore, and actually David Ruggles assisted him when he got to New York. You know, Douglass wrote his autobiography later, and he talked about thinking about escape a lot beforehand, before he actually managed to do it. And I think quite a few of these fugitives, that would be the case.
Are there any statistics to show which geographic areas are having slaves experience more success in their escape? Are these slaves living in the upper South? Are they coming from the lower South?
Well, that's a great question, of course. And, you know, if you look at a map, you can probably figure out that it's a lot easier to escape from Maryland or Delaware or the Washington, D.C. area, Virginia, than it is from Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera. You know, it was just too far. So most of these, in fact, almost all of these slaves that pass through New York anyway, come from the upper South. Maryland, Virginia, that's basically about it. Out in the West, they come from Kentucky, which is right across the border, you know, right across the Ohio River from Ohio, a free state. If you're in the deep South, you're not getting up to the North. It's just too far, too difficult. There, people escape in other ways. If you're in Texas, you're likely to escape to Mexico. If you're in Georgia, you're probably, at least before the 1840s, you're likely to try to escape to Florida, where the Seminole Indians gave refuge to some fugitive slaves. And if you're in, let's say, Louisiana, you're probably going to escape to New Orleans, where you might be able to blend in with the free black community there. So the people getting up to the north in Canada are almost all coming from the upper South.
Rhonda would like to know what the consequences were for both the conductors on the railroad, the people that are helping slaves escape, and for the slaves who are caught escaping.
Well, that's, of course, a very good question. You know, the conductors, if you want to call them that, were violating the law, obviously. And after 1850, with the federal Fugitive Slave Law, which was much more rigorous and draconian than the previous laws, they faced some serious jail time. And there were some. There was a farmer in Ohio, Van Zandt, who his case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and he was fined and put in jail for assisting the escape of some fugitives. But it's interesting that most of these people who were assisting fugitives were not prosecuted. First of all, there were parts of the North where public opinion was so much in favor of them that you could never get a jury to convict. For example, in Syracuse, New York, the Underground Railroad was completely open. It was not hidden or secret at all. And nobody tried to do anything about it because the general sentiment in Syracuse was quite hostile to slavery and really in favor of helping fugitive slaves. In New York, it was a little tricky, but Sidney Howard Gay, his actions weren't exactly public, but they weren't exactly secret either. People kind of knew. A lot of people knew that Gay and people who worked in his office were assisting fugitive slaves. But I think the local authorities just didn't want to make a martyr of him by trying to put him on trial and put him in jail. So, it was dangerous, but most of these people were not really prosecuted. Now, as to the fugitives, if you were caught, that you were severely punished, no question about it. And we do know what happened to some who did escape to the North and then were sent back under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and they would be severely punished, whipped, beaten, etc., and then probably sold into the Deep South, so they couldn't try to escape again out of Maryland or Virginia.
Where did fugitive slaves settle? How far north did they have to go where they felt safe?
Well, before 1850, a lot of them settled either in rural Pennsylvania, where these Quaker farmers would employ them on their farms for a while and then maybe send them along, or in upstate New York, or in New England. New Bedford, Mass. had a lot of them, Boston. After 1850, they really had to go to Canada. You were not safe anywhere in the North, really. So that's when the large-scale immigration. There had been blacks going to Canada before, but it's really in the 1850s where they've got to leave the country in order to escape the reach of the National Fugitive Slave Law. And in fact, Canada had a census in 1861, and I found a good number of these people who passed through New York City in the Canadian census in 1861, basically living around the Toronto area. There were a number of black settlements composed of fugitive slaves and just free blacks who went up there. And so in the census, you can locate some of these same names of people who escaped 7 or 8 years earlier.
When we picture slaves, many of us picture the plantation slave working out in the cotton field or the tobacco field or indigo fields. What did escaped slaves do for work? Were they mostly in agricultural jobs, or did they have other options?
You mean when they were slaves or when they came up to the North?
When they're up in the North, when they're free.
Oh, well, some of them did in these communities in Canada. They often were farming. Now, they weren't growing cotton up in Canada or tobacco. They were doing other kind of farming. Often they would work in cities. They did the same kind of work that free black people did in the North. Now, it's not that they had the greatest opportunities. There was considerable discrimination, prejudice in the job market, and African Americans in the North and even in Canada were kind of relegated to the lowest level jobs, unskilled work, personal servants. They work in homes of white people, that kind of thing. So they found whatever work they could, but, many of them did work in cities, actually, not on farms, either as craftsmen or as in a lot of them in personal service in homes, that kind of thing.
Earlier you mentioned the movie 12 Years a Slave, and we get a visual image of the slave catchers. How big of a threat were slave catchers to fugitive slaves?
There were these bands of slaves, there were companies that was their job, slave-catching companies. Now, in 12 Years a Slave, it's a little different. These are kidnappers, and they're obviously violating the law. There were people like that, although that begins to diminish considerably in the 1840s and 50s. But still, it's going on a little bit. But there were people who advertised in New York City, in the newspapers, saying, I will capture a fugitive slave. Send me the information. I'm here in New York. I will capture the guy and send him back. So slave catchers were certainly a danger, And after 1850, it became the federal marshals. It became a federal responsibility. Up to then, it had been up to the states, and some states didn't want to do much about it. But now it was federal marshals, even federal troops. An occasion was sent in to remove fugitives and send them back to the South. So the whole situation after 1850 was much more dire for fugitive slaves.
I have to believe that these fugitive slaves are working their way into the communities where they settled. Did the community provide them any sort of protection from these slave catchers and kidnappers?
Yes, they certainly did, and there were violent altercations. In fact, in 1851 in Christiana, Pennsylvania, where a sheriff and a owner and a slave catcher tried to apprehend a couple of slaves who were living in near this town of Christiana, and a whole group of mostly blacks from the neighborhood and also some whites kind of confronted them, and a fight broke out, and one of the slave catchers was killed, actually. And this led to a trial, but not a conviction of people involved. And there were cases of violent rescues of fugitives, like the Jerry rescue up in Syracuse, where a mob just stormed the courthouse and grabbed the fugitive and sent him off to Canada. So, yes, there were places where local communities were very active in trying to protect fugitive slaves. But as time went on, that became more and more difficult because the federal government began taking more and more stronger action to make sure that the local rescues couldn't take place.
Let's talk about Harriet Tubman. Earlier you mentioned she made 7 or 8 trips down south. Could you just tell us a bit more about who she was and what she was doing when she was going down south?
Well, she was a slave in Maryland, and in 1849, I think it was, she escaped for the first time with a couple of members of her family. She had an extended family there in Maryland. And in the next several years, she went back, as I said, a number of times, mostly to lead out family members, but then other slaves kind of joined up. So each time she would have 6, 7, 8 slaves, whatever it was. And that was incredibly dangerous, obviously. But she was pretty plugged into these networks. She knew Thomas Garrett, who I mentioned before, who's in Wilmington, Delaware, and she would often bring slaves through his home. And then she appears twice in Sidney Howard Gay's record in 1855 and 56, bringing a group in through New York City. She raised money in the North, both working and also just appealing to abolitionists to help fund her activities. She was fairly well known among the abolitionist movement by the 1850s. Sidney Howard Gay, in his record, it's interesting, he refers to her as Captain Harriet Tubman, which suggests he knew who she was. It doesn't seem like he knew her because he gives a long account in his thing. He interviews her about her career and her life, but he calls her Captain Tubman, which somehow suggests that he kind of had heard of who she was. So, as I said before, this is quite unique. There's no other person. There were 1 or 2 people, even in Gay's records, there are a couple of people, a guy named Frank Wanzer, who escaped out of Virginia, I think, and then went back 6, 8 months later to lead out some other relatives. But that was pretty unusual. What Harriet Tubman did was really unusual.
How much did the Underground Railroad's efforts to help slaves escape to freedom factor into the causes of the Civil War?
Oh, yes, of course. I think the whole question of fugitive slaves was a major precipitant of the Civil War. The fact that many Northerners were helping fugitives was the catalyst for the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. I guess you have to start with the fact that in the Constitution, there is a fugitive slave clause, which says people have a right to get their fugitive slaves back. I'm paraphrasing it. It doesn't say who or how. It's a little ambiguous. And the first national law in this was passed in 1793. So there was a long history of legislation about getting back fugitive slaves. But as time went on, much later, some northern states begin to put impediments in the way. I mean, that is to say, it's not clear how do you know this guy is a fugitive? So they say, well, there has to be a trial by jury, or there has to be some evidence presented, and sometimes these things make it difficult to apprehend or send back the fugitive, and that's why you get the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 imposes federal power on the states. It's ironic because we tend to, associate the South with states' rights before the Civil War, but this was a complete violation of the rights of the states. The South did not believe in states' rights. The South believed in slavery. When states' rights was a defense of slavery, that was fine. When vigorous federal action overriding the states was necessary, they were certainly happy to do that. And the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 overrode all the criminal and other procedures that northern states had put into place. So anyway, this alarms a lot of people who aren't even that anti-slavery, but they think that the local justice system is being completely invalidated. And it reinvigorates the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad becomes more active in the 1850s, not less, despite this law, and that leads to more resentment in the South. And it becomes, as I say, a major part of the sectional crisis which is developing. And so a good example of that is when, in December 1860, when South Carolina declares it's seceding, they issue a declaration of the causes of secession. It's sort of like the Declaration of Independence, where they lay out why they're doing this. And the number one grievance against the North is the resistance to returning fugitive slaves. Now, not a lot of fugitive slaves escaped from South Carolina. It was too far. But nonetheless, this is the number one issue they raise as an example of why they can't trust the North anymore. So the fugitive slave issue is certainly, it's not the whole thing by any means, but it's certainly contributing to what William Seward called the irrepressible conflict.
We've certainly discussed the importance of the Underground Railroad. Now, I have passed many historic sites and they'll say, this is a site on the Underground Railroad. I mean, it's almost as ubiquitous as the sign, Washington slept here. Monique would like to know if there are places or historic sites associated with the Underground Railroad, either in New York City or in other places that we can visit today and know that they were actually stops or places associated.
Oh, yeah, there are plenty of places. There are churches that gave refuge in Brooklyn, New York, the church of Henry Ward Beecher, the minister there. Plymouth Church is still there. In my book, I have a little map of Underground Railroad sites in New York City. Now, most of those are gone. You know, in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, there aren't a lot of buildings still around from the 1840s. But David Ruggles' home is still there. And there are one or two other places that are still there. There's the home of the Gibbons family in the 20s, I think, which definitely they were part of the Underground Railroad and harboring fugitives in the 1850s. So, yeah, there are sites. And then if you go to other places like Syracuse or Boston, there are such sites. Now, of course, you know, a lot of buildings from back then are no longer standing. And then because of local pride or maybe the desire to attract tourists, there is a sort of tendency toward exaggeration in some places, not every single place that it claims to be a site in the Underground Railroad. I mean, the main point is the Underground Railroad was not a very organized set of, you know, fixed routes. To say this place is on the Underground Railroad is itself an exaggeration because it's not like there's a regular pathway. But there certainly are places where fugitive slaves found shelter from time to time. You know, on the other hand, I gave a talk somewhere about this, and a real estate man said to me, you know, if I am trying to sell an old house, going back that far, and I can say this was a site on the Underground Railroad, it'll raise the property value by about $50,000. So obviously that's an incentive to claim your place was on the Underground Railroad.
Definitely. As we've discussed, the Underground Railroad functioned as a somewhat clandestine network, and yet in A Gateway to Freedom, Eric presents a vivid portrayal of the New York City organization and how it operated and even some of its participants. Eric, you've talked about the record of Sidney Howard Gay, but could you also talk more about your research process? I have to believe that you looked at more than just Gay's record, and it just seems like investigating a secretive organization is very difficult to do.
It certainly is. Well, I started with Gay's record. That was what inspired me to do this project. And then you have a lot of names in it, and you then start moving outward and tracking down the names. Who are these people? The slaves are very hard to track down, but the owners, you can, you know, the guy says, well, I was the slave of Colonel Hollingsworth in Hagerstown, Maryland, and he owned 22 slaves, and so, my wife and I escaped. All right, so the first thing I try to do was say, well, are these guys telling the truth, more or less? You know, let me see if I can find out about Colonel Hollingsworth. And yeah, sure he is. You go to the census, which is now all online, and there he is, Colonel Jacob Hollingsworth, Hagerstown, Maryland, 20 slaves. So I first try to track down the owner. See, and the census back then lists the number of slaves that a person had, but it doesn't tell you the name of the slaves. So I couldn't guarantee that this guy was, but if he says he was and there were slaves, why is he lying about that? But I could certainly find the owners, and I tracked down a lot of the owners in the census, and the stories kind of really matched up. Then there were abolitionist newspapers in New York, which had, including Gay ran an abolitionist newspaper, which had some information, but not a heck of a lot, because this is secret, But the Vigilance Committee did publish reports now and then about its activities. That was valuable. And you just do the research any way you can, in every way possible. Correspondence. Gay was writing to some people in Boston and New Bedford and Syracuse, and you could track down some of that correspondence. He was in touch with William. One of the very valuable things is that William Still, the head of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, also kept records like Gay's, and you could kind of coordinate the records. Many of the same people who appear in Gay's record had come through Philadelphia, so you see them there, and comparing the two records, you get more information, and you can sort of balance out the stories. And Gay and Still were in touch with each other, sending telegrams, sending letters about people coming through. So, yeah, it's complicated research. When you're investigating a secret process, it makes it a little difficult. And I certainly don't think I told the entire story. I don't think the entire story will ever be really dug up. But nonetheless, I was happy. I was gratified that there was a lot of information. Now, one other thing, of course, there were a lot of court cases involved. When a fugitive slave is captured, it goes to a commissioner, a court, something. Once you go to court, there's a lot of documents, There's a lot of stuff that you can find. And so that was very helpful when there were these legal cases. It enables you to get a lot more detail about what was going on.
It's like following the breadcrumbs.
You follow it wherever you can, yeah.
Let's transition into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Eric, in your opinion, what might have happened if the men and women of New York City had not participated in the Underground Railroad? Would the Underground Railroad network have formed, and how would it have functioned without a hub in New York City?
Well, it's good. New York City was a very important hub, but I think without it, the Underground Railroad would have taken some different form, but it certainly would have existed. There were plenty of people in other places happy or anxious to affect fugitive slaves. And New York City was not the only hub. There were many people who were sent directly to upstate New York or New England from Philadelphia, not through New York. They would be sent through middle of Pennsylvania and up through, let's say, Lancaster, and then up into the southern tier there of New York State, and then up to Syracuse. New York was very important because it was such a transportation hub. Railroads, shipping lines went through New York City, so that made it a lot more a lot easier in a sense by the 1840s and 50s to use it as a place fugitive slaves would be coming through. As I said, on the other hand, it was dangerous in New York. And in 1854, a couple of prominent fugitives got to New York and then were captured the next day and sent back to the South. They were prominent because there was a guy and two sons, and the guy was the brother of James Pennington, who had himself escaped and was years before and was a fairly prominent black minister in New York at that time. And when his brother was captured and sent back with these two nephews of his, the Philadelphia people stopped sending. They said the New York people, their security is not good enough. They're too careless, and we're not going to send anyone through New York for a while. So they had to find other routes. Then after another year or so, they said, all right, we're going to try to send them back through New York. So it would have been more complicated, but the Underground Railroad would have existed even if there was no assistance in New York City at all.
What aspect of American slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction are you researching and writing about now?
I'm not actually. I'm still going around giving lectures about this book. It takes a little while after finishing a book to start on a new project. So I'm teaching. So I'm concentrating on that. I'm actually retiring from teaching at the end after this next spring semester, and after that, I will probably turn myself to another project. But I'm not even sure what it'll be at this point.
Well, congratulations on finishing a long teaching career.
Thank you. I'm both slightly sad about it, but I think the time has come, and, other people have to pick up the ball, and they will, of course.
And for those of us who may still have questions about the Underground Railroad and your work, where's the best place to learn more information about you and how we can get in contact with you?
I have a website, www.ericfoner.com, which lists many things I've done. It has copies of all the articles I've written over the past 10, 15 years, information about my books. That's probably the best way to start, just going to my website.
Eric, thank you so much for telling us about the Underground Railroad and how it worked.
Very nice to talk to you. I enjoyed it.
Secret networks and dangerous escapes? Sounds like something we would go to the movies to see. But as Eric revealed, the secret operations of the Underground Railroad really happened. And the drama and adventure of the railroad's activities sounds like it would have been too much for many of us. Escaping from slavery proved to be a harrowing experience. Not only did escapees have to find a way to freedom, but they also had to keep looking over their shoulder once they arrived in a free state. As Eric recounted, slaves escaped slavery in many ways. Some raised funds to pay someone like Captain Albert Fountain to smuggle them across free state lines. Others found a brave soul like Harriet Tubman to lead them to freedom. And still others attempted escape on their own. Between the 1830s and 1860s, the Underground Railroad's communications and transportation network helped thousands of slaves make their way to freedom. But as Eric reminded us, for as many slaves as the brave Americans helped, many millions more remained in bondage. If you would like to discover more about Eric, his book, Gateway to Freedom, plus everything we talked about today, be sure to check out the blog post for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/059. Thank you for joining the Ben Franklin's World movement. This movement is about restoring history to the forefront of the public mind. And your social shares, app downloads, word-of-mouth support, and financial support are critical to the success of this movement and this show. If you would like to become a member of the movement, text Support BF World to 33444 or check out benfranklinsworld.com/movement for more information. Are you looking for that perfect holiday gift for your friends and family members? Why not give them the gift of history by giving them the Ben Franklin's World app? The app is free. All you have to do to gift it to them is send them to benfranklinsworld.com/apps, or the next time you see them, why not take their phone and download it for them? Finally, I need your help. Have you ever visited an historic site associated with the Underground Railroad? I'm not sure I ever have, and now I'm on the lookout for interesting places to visit. Let me know where I should go. Email your advice to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode, or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.